Hidden Object Guru here with a look at perhaps the biggest question remaining in The Devil in Me. Now that the handwriting evidence has conclusively proven that Grantham Dumet is actually two men, Hector Monday and the Dollmaker, we can't help but wonder, who exactly is the Dollmaker? The developers have included some clues to his identity. They wouldn't put this much work into Hector's backstory and then just been like, oh, and there's another guy there too, don't worry about it. No, there has to be an answer somewhere in the game if you look carefully enough, which is exactly what we've been doing over the past year. And the result is that I've developed a theory. Now, there's not a ton of evidence to support this theory, but what evidence I've found is so logically compelling that I'm certain of it nonetheless, which is, why I'm making a video about it. Let's start with what we know for sure. In 1993, Hector Monday traveled to Georgia to hunt a crazed murderer that the press dubbed the Imaginary Killer. I'm not sure why. I also don't know why they called Hector the Shoeshine Killer. In the world of The Devil in Me, the press just doesn't seem to be great at their jobs. The Imaginary Killer's MO is to kill people, preserve parts of their bodies, and then use those body parts to make bizarre animatronics. You can see his handiwork literally all over the game. While Hector didn't catch the Imaginary Killer in 1993, we know that Hector did track him down years later, and they partnered up to create Grantham Dumet. What else can we say about the man? Basically, just one thing. In all likelihood, he is a medical doctor. His comfort with chopping up bodies, his familiarity with the ins and outs of human anatomy, the fact that there's blood prepared for transfusion in the fridge next to the freezer room, and of course, the way he hollowed out Erin, but kept her heart running using elaborate medical technology. While it's obvious that the Dollmaker's hobby is taxidermy and animatronics, his job was being a medical doctor, most likely a surgeon, or possibly a pathologist. Make a note of this, it's going to be important later. Now, let's look at the psychology of Grantham Dumet, and ask what it can tell us about Hector Monday, the person. There are three key elements to the Grantham Dumet MO. First is the H.H. Holmes stuff. The replica of the hotel, the costumes, the whole murder castle vibe. That goes back to the interviews with Manny Sherman, and the way it offered the perfect means to invite victims and get away with murder. Second is all of the animatronics using human parts. As we've just mentioned, that can be chalked up to the Dollmaker's passions and obsessions, which, tragically, we don't have any window into. Although, back-of-the-envelope character sketching, I'd guess he was raised by an abusive father who was super into hunting and skinning animals. Then there's the third element to the MO, forcing people to make life or death choices. Both questions of whether you sacrifice yourself or kill someone else, or being forced to choose who lives and who dies between two people who are important to you. So if the animatronics came from the Dollmaker, and the Holmes obsession came from Sherman, where did this crucial choice fixation come from? It stands to reason that this is Hector's contribution to Dumet's psychology, doesn't it? Now, before you say that the choice thing is only there because this is an interactive movie and that's inherent to the genre, take a moment and think about how much thought is put into these games, and how thoroughly Supermassive works out their characters. Things don't happen in these games just because. They happen because characters want them to, and then the players have to make choices in response to the situations that are created. If you're going to make a villain who is built around forcing people to make horrible choices, you have to come up with a reason for the villain to have that obsession. Look at Until Dawn, where Josh's unrequited love for Chris makes him test the poor man over and over again. Or look at the Saw franchise. In the first film, we're told that the Jigsaw Killer wants to see how far people will go to survive. Then, in the second film, it's revealed that even as he was preparing himself to die from his cancer, John Kramer found that he had untapped reserves of self-preservation that drove him to survive the near-fatal car accident. That traumatic event, combined with the deep reserves of rage he has, based on his envy of all the people he felt were failing to appreciate their lives, while he, a guy who appreciates life, was gonna die. He's still a horribly selfish, monstrous psychopath, of course, but you can understand the steps that led him to his specific kind of psychosis. He wanted to force people to go through everything he went through so that more people will see the world the way he does. And then Costas Mandalore just killed them anyway by sabotaging the traps because he was mad about his sister dying? Anyway, let's just say the later Saw films aren't very well written. But I've drifted from the point, which is that all history has shown that way more thought has gone into character development in Dark Pictures games than you'd ever see in a Saw film. So it's fair to expect that Hector has more motivation for his choice obsession than the fact that the genre dictates it. there has to be a choice somewhere in Hector's past. Something significant, and given the fact that he seems to have a fondness for involving family members in his games, we see 3 instances of it: the husband and wife in the Saw Tower trap, Kurt having to choose between his boss and his wife, and the Morellos having to pick between their 2 daughters. With that much of a focus on family and choices, we can infer that there was a choice somewhere in Hector's past, one that is crucial to his character and involves family. Now let's ask one more question. Why is it important that Hector's mother is old? According to the game, she was born in 1919 and didn't have Hector until 1965, when she was 45 years old, which, especially for the 60s, is very old to be having a first child. Her being elderly by the time Hector got out of high school is a choice made by the developers. So why did they make that choice? You can say it's so that she'd be raising him alone, because, as the letter to Hector's father says, her parents are too old to help. But you can just as easily have written that character as estranged from her parents, or that her parents are dead. Narratively, not having grandparents to help out with a child does not require the mother to be 45 years old with a newborn. You can say that it's because the developers wanted her death to be part of Hector's motivation, but that doesn't require her to be elderly either. She dies at age 79 from lung cancer because she was a heavy smoker. She could have just as easily have been dying at age 63 or 64. Cigarette smokers can get cancer at any age. They're cigarette smokers. Getting cancer is like their whole thing. She doesn't need to be old to be abusive to Hector. That's something parents of all ages are famous for doing. Which brings us to the question, why did the developers decide to make Lucinda Monday 45 years old when she had Hector? Have you figured it out yet? Here's a hint. How did Hector Monday track down the imaginary killer? He apparently did it while he was working with the FBI to hunt a serial killer that was actually him. Seems like he had a lot of stuff going on. He was so busy, in fact, that he couldn't possibly have had time to track a killer down. So he must have known who the imaginary killer was already. But how could he have identified him without bothering to arrest him already? The clue is right in front of us when we find the imaginary killer newspaper. Remember, there is no reason for this newspaper to be in the game except to let us know that the Dollmaker exists. It's even found in the Dollmaker's body treatment area. Remove this newspaper from the game, and it's likely no one would have ever questioned the animatronics or preserved bodies. They'd have just written it off as something that Hector did because he was crazy. No, this newspaper, which isn't even a clue on the clue board, by the way, serves the same purpose as the key in the clock from Little Hope. It's the single piece of evidence that unlocks literally everything. Okay, no more screwing around. Let's get to the answer I've been building up to this entire time. The way Hector was able to find the imaginary killer and recruit him to be the Dollmaker. The choice that defined Hector's life and made him obsessed with destroying families. The reason that the developers made Lucinda Monday 45 years old when she had Hector. With no help from the father, with no help from the grandparents. What's the one thing that a young mother can do that an old mother almost certainly can't? She would have the energy necessary to look after more than one child. Hector Monday has an identical twin brother. Lucinda Monday had twins, and gave one of them up immediately because she knew she wouldn't be able to take care of both. She never told her family, the children's father, or even Hector what she'd done. Once you entertain this possibility, you realize that it explains literally everything about Hector and Grantham Dumet. On the most surface level, it's a clear explanation for why no one can tell Hector and the Dollmaker apart, but the explanations run so much deeper than that. Look at Hector's story. He was raised in hideously abusive circumstances by his monster of a mother. He escapes from her and trains as a psychologist, likely motivated to try and understand all of his own darkest urges. This naturally leads him to the FBI, where that kind of thinking is valued in the hunt for serial killers. 4 years later, he's investigating the imaginary killer. As I mentioned earlier, it's patently obvious that the killer has surgical skills. No profiler would have missed that likelihood, so it's only natural that Hector and the rest of the FBI team would have looked into local doctors. And while doing so, he would have made a discovery that blew up his whole world. He would have met a young surgeon who looked exactly like him. Now, we have no idea what this man is named. He's the imaginary killer, he's the Dollmaker, he's a surgeon. But there are zero clues as to what his real name is that I was able to locate. For the sake of clarity, though, I've got to call him something, and since he's Hector's brother, think of this man as Paris Monday. Paris, who may not have even known that he was adopted up until that point, would have been shocked to find out that the FBI agent hunting him was also his twin brother, and likely would have reached out to Hector in an effort both to find out where he's from and keep Hector from realizing that he was the imaginary killer. Now, Think about what this would do to Hector's psyche. Everything he suffered, every brutalization, every indignity, every bit of torture that his mother visited upon him. It didn't have to happen. It just as easily could have happened to Paris. It was just bad luck that he was the one who wound up a tortured mess, and Paris went to a more stable home and became a doctor. But of course, it wasn't luck. It was a decision. Lucinda made a choice about which baby to keep and which one to give away. And that single choice led to a lifetime of torment for Hector. How could he not become obsessed with these choices destroying families when that's exactly what created him? This new fractured Hector went back to his life. He likely kept in contact with Paris. Why wouldn't he? Did he ever confront Lucinda with the knowledge of his long-lost brother? Probably not. What would be the point in that? Also, let's face it, being Lucinda's victim was one of the core components of his personality. Fighting back against her just isn't in his character. It's one of the reasons I doubt he killed her. Also that, and she's not featured in his official victim count. So Lucinda is getting sicker and Hector's world is falling apart. This was basically the worst possible time for him to run into Manny Sherman. Hector was trying to figure out who he was, and Manny had a personality on offer. He could just become H.H. Holmes. So Hector tried it out. He killed someone. And at that moment, discovering the sense of power the murder instilled in him, and feeling like it was an intrinsic part of him that he'd never been able to access before, as Holmes had previously said, it was like he was born with the devil in him. It must have hit him like a thunderbolt. If he felt this way, then obviously Paris must be the imaginary killer too. So he goes and confronts his brother, but has no interest in arresting him. Lucinda has taken a turn for the worse, and her cancer is going to kill her soon. Hector wants to pull the ripcord on his life, and he needs his brother's help to do that. Plans are quickly made. Get recordings of Lucinda so Hector can have an animatronic version of his mother to comfort him, or abuse him. Really, it's all the same as far as Hector is concerned. Get a corpse to substitute in for Hector, and then perform some dental surgery on him to ensure that there's plenty of evidence that the body is identified as Hector. Not exactly Paris' specialty, of course, but entirely possible given his skill set. From there, it just came down to planning. Years of it. Hector likely hid out at a property his brother owned while growing out his hair and beard to minimize the possibility of anyone recognizing him in the years after his faked death. We hear about him looking like a homeless man in the year 2000, for example. Finding out about the island and the elderly rich people who lived there, the two brothers, operating as Richard Belknap and Leonard Kemp, with one likely having facial hair to distinguish themselves from each other, ingratiated themselves into the couple's lives. I'm not sure how Hector proved himself useful to them, but for Paris, well, it's always handy to have a doctor around. Once the Edwards died, still unsure about whether Hector killed them or not, they don't show up in his official count, so there's no way to know. Hector took possession of the island and other resources as Leonard Kemp and began construction on the hotel. During this time, there's no reason to suspect that Paris didn't just go on with his life, while Hector devoted himself entirely to becoming Grantham Dumet. His brother could have easily just continued working as a surgeon, possibly moving his practice to Chicago. He would only have to provide logistical support until the hotel was actually completed. Keeping some position as a medical professional also makes scouting victims much easier, as it would be simple for Paris to get access to all of their potential victims' medical records, which is something we know that they did. I wouldn't be surprised if Paris moved into semi-retirement when it was time to start the murders. At 52 years old in 2017, it would be a completely natural time for him to go into an early retirement. Presumably, he kept his medical license and consulted, or even taught, as a way to maintain his access to medical databases, but he'd have plenty of resources and free time to work on his hobby. It's fairly clear that a lot of research is going into victim selection. In all likelihood, actual physical stalking as well. Somebody dropped off that box of audio tapes at Morella's house, after all. This establishes that there's someone out there checking out victims while at the same time a huge amount of maintenance is being done to prep the hotel for future victims, as well as processing the corpses into mannequins. With Hector's law enforcement background, it's likely that he's the one traveling around to find and stalk victims, while Paris gets to live out his human taxidermist fantasies, spending most of his time on the island. Really, between stalking victims, keeping the hotel presentable and functioning, and dealing with a large amount of attention the corpse preservation requires, it's perfectly obvious that more than one person has to be operating on the island. In fact, there's plenty of evidence that it's too much work for the two of them, although that can wait for another video. Right now, we're concerned with just one thing: the identity of the Dollmaker. And as you can see, all of the evidence points to a single logical conclusion, that he's Paris Monday, Hector's identical twin brother. I've been the Hidden Object Guru, thanks for watching. If you had a good time and you'd like to see more, there's buttons coming up to help with that. Questions, suggestions, go in the comments section below the video. Check out the playlist for more Dark Pictures content, and join me back here for the next video on that subject. But until then, I'll say that's right. Au revoir.